Last year, I was spending a couple of weeks in Wyoming. I had a camper fixed to the back of my pickup truck, so I was mostly staying at campgrounds or places with public access. This was one of my final days, and I needed to start heading back the way I had come. Unfortunately, my truck gave me trouble that day, and I spent most of the daylight hours trying to fix it. By the time the sun was going down, I hadn't gotten very far. I grabbed a coffee at a gas station and decided I'd drive for another 2 hours before finding a place to spend the night. After a little while, the road was empty, and I felt like I had it all to myself. I used an app to locate the closest camping area, which was just off the road on public land. When I reached the turnoff, I found a narrow dirt trail that stretched about a quarter mile into the forest. At the end was a small grassy clearing surrounded by trees. There wasn't anyone else there. I parked at the edge of the clearing, facing the way out. Then I climbed into the camper. By now, it must have been 11 or 12 at night, and I was more than ready to sleep. But just a minute after lying down, a beam of light pierced the edges of the privacy screen on my windows. I sat up and lifted a corner just enough to peek outside. A pair of headlights were coming down the path. The vehicle slowed as it reached the clearing where it stopped. It seemed like they noticed my camper and didn't want to share the spot. But instead of turning around, they just sat there, blocking the path out. From what I could make out, it was an old, rusted truck, though the bright headlights kept me from seeing much else. Something felt wrong. My gut told me something was off, and after a few minutes, I realized I wouldn't be sleeping here. I started folding up my bed. Just as I was getting ready to leave the camper and hop into the driver's seat, I heard one of their truck doors open. I glanced out the window. Their headlights were off now, and 2 men stood outside in the dark. I could barely make out the shapes of objects in their hands. I quickly covered the window again and listened as they slowly approached, trying to be quiet. They moved around my truck until they suddenly stopped, like they somehow realized I was awake. "Hey, can you help us out? We need directions. Open up," one of them called. Their voices were slurred, and I was scared. They sounded drunk, and I had no idea what they might do. Peeking through the window again, I saw one man close to my truck, holding what looked like a crowbar or something similar. That was all the proof I needed of their bad intentions. The other man walked up to the camper door, scraping something against it and pressing hard, trying to force it open. I braced my legs against the door, holding it shut. Out of nowhere, a gunshot rang out. It wasn't from the men. It came from somewhere deeper in the woods. Both men froze for a second, then bolted back to their truck. Within half a minute, they were gone. I wasn't sure who fired that shot, but I knew this was my chance to get out. I scrambled out of the camper and into my truck. I glanced around as I started the engine, but I didn't see anyone in the woods. I drove back down the dirt path and onto the main road, not stopping until I reached a busy truck stop an hour later. To this day, I don't know exactly what happened. Maybe a hunter or another camper saw the situation and fired a warning shot to help me. Given how remote the area was, it seems unlikely, but that's the only explanation I can think of. If not for that shot, my truck and camper might be listed on Craigslist by now, and I might never have been seen again. This happened a little over 2 years ago. My name is Alex, and before this experience, I had no clue about camping. I really wanted to give it a shot, though, and figured the only way to learn was to actually go out and try it. So, this was my very first camping trip. I picked a campsite about 2 hours away from my town. It seemed like a good balance, not too crowded, but I also wouldn't be completely isolated, which felt ideal for a beginner. I drove there and reached the trailhead around noon. After that, I hiked a few hours to get to the campground. The place had some park benches and a couple of ground-mounted barbecue grills. There were a few smaller trails leading to individual sites where other campers had already pitched their tents. I followed one of these paths, found a spot, and spent about an hour setting up my tent and making sure everything was in order. By the time I finished, a small group of people were hanging out by the grills, chatting. I'm not the most outgoing person, so I didn't feel comfortable joining them. But about 30 minutes later, a guy walked over to where I was set up and invited me to join the group. He seemed friendly, so I went along. I met a few of the other campers, and they all seemed pretty nice. I stayed and talked with them for about an hour. Eventually, people started splitting off, so I said goodnight and went back to my tent. It was probably around 7 p.m., with just about an hour of daylight left. Then that guy, his name was Ryan, came back over to my tent. He looked to be around my age, maybe mid-20s. He asked if I'd been to this area before, and I said no. Then he mentioned a hidden lake nearby that he said was a fantastic spot, almost like a secret place no one knew about. He said he was planning to check it out and asked if I wanted to come along. It seemed like a nice offer, and honestly, I was curious. I tossed my things back into my tent, left everything behind, and followed him. He said it was only a 10-minute walk through the woods, so we'd definitely make it before sunset. From the campsite, we followed a narrow path through the trees. It wasn't a clear trail, but it looked like it had been used before. After 10 minutes, though, there was still no lake. Ryan, who had been chatty and cheerful before, suddenly got quiet, giving me short answers. He kept glancing at the sunset, and while it seemed like he was checking the time, something in me felt like he was waiting for the light to fade. After 20 minutes of walking, I started to slow down and keep a little distance between us. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling, and my adrenaline kicked in. The sun's light barely filtered through the trees now, and the woods suddenly felt unnervingly quiet. When I saw a chance, I turned and tried to slip away quietly, heading back the way we'd come. But Ryan noticed immediately. He called out to me in a friendly tone at first, as if trying to keep up the act. Then his voice turned angry, and I heard him running after me. For about a minute, he shouted and chased me through the trees. I could hear his footsteps slowing, and then there was a loud metallic clang just behind me. I glanced back for a second and saw what looked like a knife hitting a tree trunk a few feet away. It seemed like a final, desperate move to stop me. After that, I managed to lose him. I made it back to the others and told them what happened. One of them called the police. Ryan, or whatever his real name was, never returned. The others mentioned that he'd already been there when they arrived, and oddly, he didn't have a tent anywhere. I guess he chose me because I was alone and clearly inexperienced. Thankfully, I never found out what his real intentions were. If I had, I probably wouldn't be here to tell this story. I was in Oregon, spending a few days hiking through remote areas of a national park. I was already about 20 miles away from the closest road, and for the first 2 days, I hadn't seen a single person. It was early fall, and the weather was colder than most people would tolerate, but I was prepared with all the right gear. That morning, I got up, made a quick cup of coffee using my portable stove, and then set off toward my next campsite. It was about 6 miles away, which is a long trek when you're in the mountains. After about 4 hours of walking, I suddenly heard footsteps ahead. Looking up, I saw a man coming toward me, walking in the opposite direction. I hadn't expected to see anyone, but I smiled and gave a nod as he passed. Something about him struck me as odd. He didn't have a backpack, no water bottle, nothing at all. He wore just a long-sleeved shirt and some worn-out hiking pants. I turned around to glance back out of curiosity, and right then, he glanced back too. Not wanting to seem awkward, I just faced forward and kept walking. After I got a bit farther, I shrugged it off, figuring maybe he had a campsite nearby and was just out for a short walk. But deep down, I knew there weren't any designated campsites close to that area. I didn't think much more of it, though, and continued my hike. The next few hours were tough, but I eventually reached the campsite. It was empty with just enough space to pitch my tent. The place wasn't quite what I'd hoped for. The view was supposed to be impressive, but it was blocked by trees. It felt more like being stuck in a dense forest than on a mountain. Still, I was worn out and quickly set up my tent before settling in to relax and watch the sunset. As I sat there, I heard a faint rustling sound behind me. When I turned around, I was stunned to see the same man from earlier. He still didn't have a backpack or any gear. What puzzled me even more was that he was here at all. He'd been walking the opposite way when I last saw him, so he must have turned back not long after we passed each other. He walked right up to the other side of the clearing and sat down. No tent, no sleeping bag, just sitting on the ground and gazing into the woods. He was maybe 15 feet away, and because he wasn't looking at me, I got a better look at him. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with short brown hair and a scruffy beard. Unease crept over me. Something wasn't right, and as the sun dipped lower, that feeling only grew worse. Who was this guy, and why was he out here, 25 miles into the wilderness, with no food, water, or shelter? After about 30 minutes of him sitting still, I decided I couldn't stay. I didn't have another campsite lined up, but I figured it was better to find a random spot than risk staying near him. As I started to take down my tent, he finally turned his head and locked eyes with me. From that moment, he didn't look away. Every time I glanced up, he was staring at me. Once I packed everything into my backpack, I noticed him standing up in my peripheral vision. I began walking away as quickly as I could, gripping my small knife tightly. His footsteps followed close behind. I risked a glance back. He was still there, but slowly falling behind. Thinking fast, I decided to leave the trail and head into the woods. By then, it was completely dark, and I hoped he wouldn't notice. Once I was about 20 feet in, I hid behind a tree and waited. About 30 seconds later, I heard his footsteps approach. Just as he passed my hiding spot, he stopped. I watched his silhouette in the darkness as he looked around, like he knew I wasn't on the path anymore. Then he started calling out, his tone oddly friendly, which made it even creepier. After 2 minutes of shouting, he stopped. Instead of returning to the campsite, he stepped off the trail and into the woods on the other side. I watched his figure fade into the trees, and then everything went silent. I stayed hidden for over an hour before finally moving again. I pushed myself to keep going, skipping the next campsite just to be sure. When I got back to town, I reported the incident to the local police. They never followed up. I don't know if that man was living out there trying to rob or kidnap people or both, but I'm lucky I made it out when I did. This happened 3 years ago, right at the start of December. In my area, it doesn't get too cold until the middle of the month, and snow typically doesn't fall until early January. I enjoy camping frequently, and I try to squeeze in as many trips as possible before winter sets in and I'm stuck indoors for months. I planned ahead and took a weekend off work in early December for one last camping trip. I picked a location about an hour's drive north. I knew it would be a bit colder there, but I didn't think it would make much difference. Besides, I had camping gear designed for low temperatures. I set out early in the morning and reached the trailhead just a couple of hours after sunrise. There were 2 other vehicles there, a standard minivan and a truck that looked like it had been through some rough trails, covered in mud and scratches. I parked and started down the trail. The air was brisk, so I pulled on my jacket and hat. Not long into my walk, I passed an older man and his child, who looked like they had camped the previous night. That explained one of the vehicles. When I arrived at the campsite, I expected to find one other group or person, but it was empty. Just an open grassy area beside a flowing pond, with no other people or tents in sight. I pitched my tent near the edge by the trees. At first, I spent time writing in my journal, but as the day went on, the temperature dropped. To stay warm, I got up and built a campfire. Before long, someone else appeared on the trail. It was a man, maybe around 40 years old, wearing a thick coat and a cloth covering his face. He had a small backpack, but when he walked past me and moved to the far side of the campsite, I noticed his bag looked empty, barely holding anything. He settled down and leaned against a tree. I thought he might be waiting for a friend further down the trail, but after about 45 minutes, no one else showed up, and the man hadn't moved. He just sat there, staring at the pond. I wasn't sure if I should feel sorry for him or creeped out. Then, out of nowhere, he got up and walked toward me. He stopped across the campfire, sat down, and smiled over the flames. "Hope you don't mind if I warm up here. It's colder than I expected," he said. I nodded, trying to be polite but feeling uneasy. Something about his smile felt off. The rest of his face didn't match. His eyes looked tired and droopy, making the smile seem forced. "Do you have a tent? It's going to get even colder tonight," I asked. He shook his head, still smiling, but didn't look worried at all. We sat there in silence for about 10 minutes. During that time, I decided I wanted to leave, but I was nervous about packing up in front of him. The sun was almost down, so if I was going to leave, it had to be soon. I stood up, went to my tent, grabbed my sleeping bag, and started rolling it up. I could feel his eyes on me. When I turned around, he was staring, still with that unsettling smile. He stood up, kept his gaze on me, then walked back to the tree where he had been before. But instead of stopping, he continued walking into the woods and disappeared from sight. I paused, listening for his footsteps, but the forest was silent. I didn't know what was going on, but I was sure he'd come back. I hurriedly packed up my gear, and within 2 minutes, I was headed down the trail. I left the campfire burning, hoping if he was watching, he'd think I was still there. The 2-hour walk back was terrifying. Cold and dark, every moment worried I'd hear footsteps rushing behind me. I made it to my car safely. As I drove away, I noticed the muddy truck was gone. If that truck wasn't his, I have no idea how he got there. If I had stayed the night, something bad might have happened. Maybe he went into the woods to get something or waited for me to feel safe enough to sleep. Whatever he intended, the memory of that night still chills me to this day. This took place in 2017. Back then, I lived in a small, isolated town where everyone knew each other. The area was surrounded by flat land and thick forest. The main things to do for fun were hiking or camping. Otherwise, you had to drive about 45 minutes to the nearest slightly bigger town. My friend Jake and I loved camping, and one time he mentioned that another buddy had told him about a good camping spot. We decided to check it out. The place was just a 20-minute drive from the edge of town. There wasn't any official parking, so we just parked on the side of the road. The trail leading in was faint and narrow, clearly not used very often. After walking for about an hour, we finally reached the campsite. Apparently, there was supposed to be a nice view of a lake, but whoever told Jake about it must have been joking because there was no lake, just a murky, overgrown swamp. It looked like it might have been nice a few years back. We laughed it off, but then Jake pointed out a tent on the far side of the swamp. It was too distant to see any details, just a lone tent among the trees. I scanned the edge of the water and noticed someone standing there, directly across from us. They were just watching. I gave a small wave to ease the awkwardness. We figured they were probably the camper who owned the tent. We set up our tents on a small hill a little away from the swamp and went on with our day. We played some games and chatted. Every now and then, we glanced toward the water, and it struck us as odd that we never actually saw the person near their tent. They were either gone or wandering through the trees farther away. As it got dark, there were a few hours when the person seemed to disappear completely. We gathered wood to build a fire, set up our chairs, and made dinner. We were talking and laughing when Jake suddenly jumped out of his chair, eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned around. In the shadows, about 20 feet away, stood a figure with long, messy dark hair, dressed in dark clothes. The poor lighting made it impossible to tell if it was a man or woman or if they were holding anything. "Hey, are you all right?" Jake asked. I followed up with a quick, "Need help?" The figure paused for a moment, then quickly walked away. We were both unnerved, but we managed a shaky smile, trying to dismiss it like, "What was that about?" I don't remember exactly what explanation we came up with, but it must have been enough for us to continue with our night. Somehow, we even managed to sleep, probably because we were young and overconfident. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by Jake unzipping my tent and shaking me. He was breathing hard, eyes wide with fear. As I climbed out, he explained that he woke up to sounds outside his tent. When he unzipped it, he saw the same figure standing right next to my tent. When they noticed him, they took off running. Jake was seriously panicking, so I tried to stay calm. Our options were to risk walking back through the dark or stay put. We decided to keep the fire going and stay up until morning. We packed up our gear just in case we had to leave in a hurry. The moment daylight broke, we left. Later that day, we decided to file a report with the local police to warn others about the strange person. We didn't expect a response, but we got a call back asking us to come in for questioning. It turned out that the tent we saw belonged to someone who had been reported missing for over a month. They had searched the area but hadn't found anything else. The police showed us photos of the missing person, and Jake and I were both sure it wasn't the same person we'd seen. That realization was chilling. Whoever we encountered might have had something to do with the disappearance. If Jake hadn't woken up when he did, I might have been the next one to go missing. I was camping in a wooded area at the back of my property. I own a decent patch of forest, and sometimes I enjoy taking short camping trips there. The spot I cleared for camping is just a 10 to 15-minute walk from my house. It doesn't offer any amazing views or lakes, just a quiet, peaceful place to unwind in nature. This happened sometime in mid-autumn, and on that particular day, I headed out around 4 p.m. After arriving, I began setting up my campsite. While doing so, I noticed someone walking about 100 yards away in the woods. Since it was technically my land, it felt a little odd to see someone there. The neighboring properties bordered my land, so the only way they could have gotten there was by trespassing. I wasn't angry, just puzzled about how and why they were out there. They seemed to be walking toward my neighbor's property, away from my house, so I decided to ignore it. For the next 3 hours, everything was quiet. I lounged in my camping chair, listening to the calming sounds of the forest. As the sun set, the woods grew dark and a light fog settled in. I started a fire in the fire pit I had prepared, feeding it with logs and sticks. About an hour after nightfall, as I was adding more wood to the fire, I suddenly heard footsteps in the distance. I turned around and listened more closely. Someone was running full speed through the forest. The darkness made it impossible to see clearly, but I could hear them sprinting past my campsite, deeper into the woods, the sound fading into the distance. It was unmistakably a person, but I couldn't understand why someone would be running through the forest so late at night. The whole thing left me uneasy. I thought about packing up and heading home, but whoever it was didn't seem to notice or care about me. I decided to stay, figuring I was close enough to home if something happened. The night stayed quiet after that, and I kept the fire going for another 2 hours. Around 10 p.m., I let the fire burn out and crawled into my tent. I fell asleep quickly but didn't stay asleep long. I woke up to the sound of footsteps running toward my tent. My eyes snapped open as the footsteps stopped just outside, about a foot away. I sat up, and through the thin fabric of the tent, I could make out the outline of someone leaning back and forth, as if trying to see inside. Suddenly, I heard a tearing sound. My eyes shifted left, and I saw a knife cutting a slit in the fabric. Through the opening, a pair of eyes stared at me. Panic surged through me. I leapt up, bolted out of the tent, and screamed as I ran through the woods. My adrenaline kept me going until I reached my house. Thankfully, I didn't hear anyone following me. When I called the police and looked out the back window, I saw a figure standing among the trees, watching me. By the time officers arrived, whoever it was had disappeared. The next morning, the police returned to investigate the campsite, but no leads turned up, even after days of searching. The most frightening part wasn't just that someone was wandering around my property at night with a knife and cutting into my tent. It was the fact that they followed me back to my house. They knew where I lived. For the next month, I barely slept, constantly on edge. So far, nothing else has happened. If it does, I'll try to update you. My sister Mia and I moved to Utah a few years ago. We both loved the idea of living near the mountains, but neither of us could afford it alone. So we decided to split the rent on a townhouse just outside Salt Lake City. It turned out to be a great spot because we were only a short drive, about 15 minutes, from a vast range of hiking trails. One thing I should mention about these trails is that they're usually crowded. The area is so easy to reach for locals and tourists alike that finding solitude is tough most of the year. Because of this, my sister and I decided to plan a 3-day backpacking trip to get away from the usual crowds and hopefully find some peace and quiet. I left it to Mia to plan our route, and a couple of weeks later, we drove to the trailhead. When we arrived, there was just one other vehicle parked there. A dusty old pickup truck that looked like it had seen better days. Since there seemed to be only one other person hiking this path, we started off feeling positive. The first day was an 8-mile hike. The trail was mostly flat until the last few miles, where it started climbing up the side of a mountain. It was exhausting, but Mia promised the campsite would be worth it. And she was right. About 3/4 up the mountain, we found a small, level spot on the cliffside with an incredible view of the valley below. The sunset made it even more breathtaking. After soaking in the view, we pitched our tents and gathered some wood and rocks to build a fire pit. When the fire was burning steadily, we sat down and started chatting. We must have talked for at least 2 hours before we both heard something strange coming from the trail. We fell silent, listening to footsteps approaching our campsite. A minute later, a man stepped out of the darkness into the faint light of our fire. He wasn't using a headlamp, something every hiker knows is essential if you're out after dark. The moment he walked up, Mia and I both felt something was off. He was smiling, but the smile didn't feel right. "Need something?" Mia asked, standing up. The man looked at her, then at me, his smile fixed in place. He said he was a park officer and had been tracking us. He claimed the trail was closed for the season and we had to leave immediately. But something didn't add up. We knew the park was open, and we had even gotten permits just the day before. Plus, no ranger would be patrolling a mountain trail at night. If he wasn't who he claimed, then what was he doing there? Mia and I exchanged a glance, both of us thinking the same thing. We started asking questions, but the man cut us off. "You need to pack up now and come with me," he said firmly. "I'll take you back to the trailhead." We stood there, stunned. Something felt seriously wrong. The man didn't move, just stood by the fire with that unsettling grin. "We're staying here," Mia finally said. The man looked at her, then at me, still smiling. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the darkness. We were too scared to speak. For several minutes, we listened to make sure he wasn't coming back. Then we threw more dry wood on the fire, keeping it blazing. There was no chance we'd sleep that night. Every so often, we thought we heard footsteps, but we never saw him again. At sunrise, we packed up quickly, deciding to cut the trip short. We retraced our path back to the car. That same dusty pickup truck was still there, which made us wonder. Had that other hiker run into the same man? What happened to them? We reported the incident to the police, but they didn't find anything. It was clear the man had lied about being a park officer, and his attempt to lead us away in the middle of the night suggested he had something terrible in mind. We never found out what it was, but the thought that the other hiker might have learned the answer still haunts us. I used to go camping a lot with some friends from university, but after we finished our studies, everyone's schedules got so hectic we couldn't find time to go together. So I started camping by myself. There was a campsite we frequented back then, so I decided to stick with what I knew and went back there. It was a bit remote and not easy to reach, which was part of its appeal. Because there were more convenient spots nearby, this one was usually empty. Since I knew the route well, I arrived without any trouble and set up my gear. Not long afterward, a man appeared. He looked like a regular hiker, but he only carried a small backpack, definitely not enough for a tent or camping supplies. What puzzled me was that this place wasn't particularly scenic. It was a nice open spot surrounded by trees for camping, but if you weren't planning to stay overnight, there was no real reason to come out this far. At the time, I didn't give it much thought. He seemed normal enough. Maybe he just wanted some peace and quiet. I stayed near my tent while he stayed on the far end of the campground. Around 6 p.m., I stepped away to cook my dinner. As I was boiling water on my mini stove for a freeze-dried meal, I noticed the man finally leaving. It struck me as odd it would be dark within the hour, and the hike back probably took about 3 hours. Still, I was glad to be on my own. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I finished eating and sat near my tent. I hung a small lantern on the tent side to enjoy the fading light. That's when it hit me. I was truly alone. Normally, this would be the time when my friends and I gathered around a campfire to chat. By myself, there wasn't much to do. After a while, I turned off the lantern, went inside the tent, and lay down for the night. Sometime later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. The night was completely dark, and I had no idea how long I'd been sleeping. The footsteps grew louder, getting closer until they stopped at the other end of the campground. I fumbled for the lantern, switched it on, and unzipped the tent flap. About 20 feet away, a figure stood exactly where I'd seen that man earlier. From what I could make out, it seemed to be the same person. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. At that time of night, it was deeply unsettling. When I turned on my light, he clearly saw me. "Hey, are you all right?" I called out. He didn't respond. I couldn't tell if he was facing me or turned away, and somehow both possibilities felt equally creepy. My heart pounded as I reached for the pocket knife in my backpack. I had no choice but to sit there and wait. The next 15 minutes were the longest of my life. The man barely moved. Then suddenly he turned and walked off the way he'd come. From his movements, I realized he had been facing me the whole time, just staring. A cold chill ran down my spine as his footsteps faded into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, staying alert in case he returned. As far as I know, he never did. When morning came, I packed up and left, making it home safely. I still don't know what that man's intentions were, but whatever they were, it was deeply disturbing. The thought that I might not have woken up in time still terrifies me. I haven't been camping since. A few nights ago, I was camping in a remote area not far from my home. I'm not much of a hiker, so I rarely go more than a mile or two on any trail. This spot was about 1.5 miles from where I had parked my car at the trailhead. I planned to spend the weekend there, camping by a river, with the intention of staying for 3 nights. On the third morning, I walked back to my car to grab my fishing gear and some extra snacks. I figured I'd spend the afternoon trying to catch some fish since I had the time. But when I returned to my campsite, I noticed another tent pitched farther down the riverbank. I didn't see anyone nearby. At first, I brushed it off, though it did occur to me that I hadn't come across anyone on the only trail that led to this part of the river. Still, I assumed there might be another route I wasn't aware of. I set up my fishing line and got to it. Every 20 minutes or so, I'd glance at the tent, but in the 3 hours I fished, I didn't see anyone appear. As the sun started setting, I packed up my gear and headed back to my camp. I ate a quick meal, gathered some wood for the fire, and waited for nightfall before lighting it. As soon as the flames flickered to life, I saw a shadow move in the trees ahead of me. The figure was just outside the fire's glow, and after that brief moment, the forest was pitch black again. I figured it was probably the person from the other tent collecting firewood. It was odd timing, but I decided not to let it bother me. I leaned back in my chair, taking in the peaceful view of the fire, sky, and river. It was so tranquil that I nearly dozed off right there. About 30 minutes later, I noticed movement beyond the fire. This time, I could make out several figures emerging from the trees. As they got closer, I counted 4 men heading straight for my campsite. My mind was racing, but I tried to stay calm, hoping they were just fellow campers needing assistance. When they stepped into the firelight, I saw they were all in their 30s or 40s, their faces expressionless. They kept walking until they were only a few feet away. Nervously, I stood up and asked what they wanted. None of them answered. 2 of the men moved behind me toward my tent, while the other 2 shoved me aside. At that point, it was clear what was happening, but I knew fighting back would only make things worse. The 2 men started rummaging through my belongings as the others forced me farther from my campsite. I kept trying to talk to them, but their cold, empty eyes made it clear they didn't care. I kept telling myself to stay calm and let them take whatever they wanted. But the men continued pushing and dragging me deeper into the forest, away from the light. After a minute or so, I could barely see anything, and the only sound was our footsteps crunching through the silent woods. We finally stopped. I turned to face them, my fear overwhelming me. One of the men reached for something, and without thinking, I bolted. My feet pounded against the leaves and dirt as I ran. I had a rough idea of the direction I needed to go and focused on reaching the trail. Once I found the path, I sprinted toward my car, glancing back but seeing no one following me. I jumped into my truck and drove away. Later, I reported everything to the police, but most of my gear was gone, and there were no clues about who they were. What they intended to do by dragging me into the woods is terrifyingly clear, and I feel incredibly lucky to have escaped with my life.